Ever heard the expression, a picture is worth 1,000 words? Well, today's guest uses photography to reveal the story of his subject. Based in New York City, Tau Battice was born in Bastille, St. Kitts, and he uses photography, in his own words, to, quote, preserve the moment, proclaim nuance, and propel humanity to positive action, end quote. So today we have the pleasure of welcoming Tau Battice to Good Morning, SKN.
Good morning.
Tau, good morning.
Good morning, SKN. Such a pleasure to be here.
I realized that you had Kortensia trying to figure out who your relatives were. So maybe asking who's your daddy with what she was saying a little earlier. Some semblances, right? Some resemblances to some famous people we said Tau had.
Some really famous people.
All right, so Tau, speaking of who's your daddy, why is it termed that way? You know, an ethno-visual exploration.
Well, ethno-visual in that I use visuals to explore particular communities, and you know that ethno comes from the old Greek ethnos, which means tribe. And so I'm looking at communities specifically using the lens, but I also interview people within those communities. Kind of like to bring a light to specific groups of people. And in this case, we have Who's Your Daddy? Who's Your Daddy is the name of the show. The long-term project is called Daddying. And it's really like we make daddy an active verb, but it's me exploring Black fathers' relationships with their sons. And as you spoke about relatives earlier, my father is right there in St. Kitts. He's from Newtown, as we say, Newtown. So, but his name is Tumba Cornelius, and he's right there. I mean, he texted me just this morning. So we have a very active relationship. And I was essentially raised by my father when my mother left to come to the United States in the 1980s. So coming from a very healthy relationship with my father, I mean, I sought to see that in the world, and I see it much in the world. So that's what this project is about.
Atumba's your father? This is a really small world. I know your father very well. I know your brothers very well as well. This is all right. Welcome home.
Yes.
Oh, lovely.
And he's a teenage father, so much is said of that. You know, my father was 19 when I was born. My mother was about to be 17. So in many ways, I grew with them, and they made my world. Young parents. So.
Okay, so as a photographer, how do you manage to capture the essence of the father and son relationships? Were the subject asked to pose a certain way for you to capture their unawareness?
I believe when I go into a project, I have an idea of what I might like things to look like. So I have certain aesthetics, maybe certain poses, but I like to let people's natural personalities come out, because ultimately I want a portrait that the sons can be proud of 50 years from now, grandsons can be proud of. So for the most part, I mean, a lot of these particular portraits are made on the street, and a lot of people have been asking me, where's my studio? This particular studio is a corner in Harlem, but I isolated that corner in 2013, and I thought how nicely it would play as a simple backdrop to let the emotions and the feelings and the humanities of the fathers be brought forth.
And speaking of those photos, they're generally in black and white. Was there, I assume that was deliberate, does it better help you to convey a particular message?
Yes, there's a lot of cliche about how black and white strips down to bare emotions, and maybe some of that is true, and black and white is more classic, and I guess there's a black and white right behind me as I speak. But for me, most of my projects are in color, and because I primarily shoot the African diaspora, I love to show the skin tones. So if I'm in Brazil or if I'm in St. Kitts, I want to bring out that tropical energy. But for this particular project, I thought, how wonderful would it be to just let the emotions and the eyes and the hands of the fathers and the sons speak? So because I was also shooting on the street where I was stopping random people, I had very limited control over how people were dressed other than whether I chose them or not. The unifying factor is that so-called black and white. So that way we can strip away all the color, all the distractions, and so we could focus on the eyes, hands, and the spirits of the individual.
I noticed in December 2021, you released your project, My Hair. What was the concept behind that?
It Well, as you said earlier, and I think we both said, my primary interest is the African diaspora. And as son of the African diaspora myself, I'm continually concerned with how people of African descent and Black people are portrayed. And so much of my work is in the Americas. So from so-called Latin America and the Caribbean, I've done projects in the Dominican Republic, Chile, Brazil, Colombia. This particular project, though, is in Brazil, which has become kind of like a second or third home to me. So over the past 5 years, I've worked in 6 different cities and photographed 115 women in Brazil. And the reason why, so the project, as you say, in English, it translates to Her Hair Reveals, but in Portuguese, it's Sua Cabelo Revela. And so Brazil speaks Portuguese, and it is also the second largest population of people of African descent after Nigeria. So Brazil got basically 50% of the Black people taken out of Africa. In comparison, the United States got 5%, and the rest went to the Caribbean, Latin America. So Brazil was almost like a natural place for me to study how Black women function in a world of Euronorm beauty, the straight hair, the skin color, and so forth. And all these permutations of Blackness, like all these different ways of being Black and the hair textures. And I went there initially in 2017 to maybe shoot 20 women for a magazine article. And the first day I got there, like before I even got my my bags to the hotel, 4 young ladies had volunteered. And what was initially a project of 20 Black women telling stories about their hair texture and how that hair might open the door to beauty, racism, opportunities within the society in terms of jobs and careers, and love. Like, who gets chosen by whom because of looks and hair texture. And it was very deep and rich. And it's really a reflection of much of the African diaspora, because a lot of these concerns about hair, to a lesser degree, I saw in St. Kitts growing up. But, you see all these concerns in Jamaica, you see it in the press, you see it in America. So the Black women of Brazil are really speaking for Black women of the world. But there's something unique happening in Brazil where there's this celebration and running towards Blackness instead of running away from it. So this project, what you saw was my first exhibit here in the United States in English. But the idea, because it is a book, the idea is to finish up the book and to tour Brazil and have that project in Portuguese. So it'll be a bilingual book. I photographed the women I photographed them, I interview them in Portuguese, translate them in English as I learn Portuguese more and more. But when it appears in Brazil, it'll be strictly in Portuguese.
So we also noticed, Tau, that you're currently working on your first monograph, Harlem in the Time of Corona. Tell us a bit about that project.
Harlem in the Time of Corona is a reaction to, obviously, the times. But since we just mentioned Brazil, I had like 3 trips planned to Brazil in 2020. I'd just come back from Brazil early 2020 when the pandemic hit. And my next trip was in April on my spring break, which I usually go on my spring break away from teaching at City University. So trip was planned for April, but then the world shut down in March, right? So all that energy, and then I was teaching online via Zoom, and lots of classes, and it was physically exhausting to be here in my space, but hearing these ambulances go by every 10 seconds, and students dropping out of school from stress and all these things pandemic related. And I was going out to grab my groceries and just watching how young men were still particularly not wearing masks in Harlem, kind of like defying what was being said. And I said, you know what, I want to document how people are living in Harlem in this time of COVID. And so I gave myself 1 year, well, at first 3 months, because we didn't think it would last that long, right? So I photographed it from April through to August and stopped the project. I capped it because I didn't want it going too long, and I wanted something that I could put into hard form very quickly. And then, pandemic kept going. And then people in Harlem are particularly stylish in the wintertime, the coats and so forth. So then I realized it was going. I said, well, let's continue this for the year. So I photographed until spring 2021. And so I photograph and I interview, but it's people reacting. Most of the portraits are mostly socially distant, people with masks or mask on the side, but they telling me about their experiences during the time. So I thought it was a very current project, a way for me to get out my creative energies, but also documenting my people and the diaspora in Harlem as they react to a global pandemic. And I thought historical significance of it, what this could look like 50 years from now, 100 years from now, in a book, in an exhibit, in some archives. So it's really me. And then, there's a saying, art reacts or artists react and should depict the time. And I don't necessarily call myself an artist, but for what I do, I'm very chronological. I'm very aware of time. And so it's only right. And it was a soul cleansing for me too, because it was the only way I socialized with people. Masks and distance and directions from like 8 feet, like move here, move there. And so it was cathartic for me in many ways.
It's very fascinating to me that as a photographer, Tau, you're able to not only see the world, but also see the world through others' eyes and represent, their experiences the way that you do. Do you have any advice for aspiring photographers here in the Federation?
Yes, be yourself. Be yourself, and whatever it is that you think is of value, research it and go into that thing. Particularly in smaller societies, I would say that because they are smaller, there's a lot of mimicry, there's a lot of competition. Find your lane. Like, I have no competitor. My only competitor is myself. I am the only one to do exactly what I do. And you have to have the confidence enough to know that and put that into the world, because the world wants that. Like, people who visit St. Kitts are not coming to St. Kitts to see how much Kittitians mimic Americans or the English or the Canadian. They're coming for what is intrinsically Kittitian. So do that. Be that. Choose projects that are Kittitian so that when they show up on the world stage, people can say, this is St. Kitts.
Yeah.